But Nick, there has been a lot of chatter and countless articles about the ABS gender pay gap data. Now, this stuff has been kicking around for 30 years. Have we learned anything yet? Is there some grand conspiracy to pay women less for the same amount of work?
I think that's a fascinating question that you ask. We have been observing this data on at least a biannual basis for 30 years. What's fascinating about it, Alexandra, is there's never been, not as far as I'm aware, there's never been a push for anyone to do an actual apples and apples comparison between the men and women's pay and have that published on a regular basis. So instead, what we get is apples and orange comparisons. So even though the ABS average weekly earnings data is better than some other surveys out there, such as the one we saw recently from the Women's Equality Gender Agency, WEGA, it's better than that. It's got problems. So when you're comparing men and women's pay, you've got to look at, firstly, hours worked. Right? That's got to be equivalent, whether part-time or full-time. You've got to look at whether the type of job that they're doing. That's critical as well. And also, you should be looking at other things which are more controversial, such as experience. So if you're a teacher, for example, a male teacher that took no time of the workforce to raise kids, is going to have probably 3, 4, maybe 5 years more experience than a female teacher that wasn't teaching in those years. And the question is, should they be paid the same if they're basically teaching the same class? So experience is also a factor. And of course, skills is another factor. Who's just more qualified. Even though you might be doing the same job, someone might be more qualified and they're slightly better at it. So all of those 4 factors, they're not taken into consideration. And the really interesting question is, why has no one actually proposed to do an apples and apples comparison and have it published on a regular basis?
I suspect because they wouldn't like the result, which would show that men and women are paid the same. Although I have to admit, Nick, my first thought when I saw your article was, how are they doing the gender pay gap when the government can't define gender? That is one question. Are we including men who identify as women in the women's pay stats? Because surely that would upset the feminists, although maybe I'm wrong. But one of your most interesting things was we expect that there to be a difference in the mining sector where you've got predominantly the dangerous high-risk jobs being done by men, so they're paid more, and the more secretarial jobs being done by women who are paid less. And as such, Western Australia has the biggest gap because a lot of mining is in Western Australia. So that all makes perfect sense. What I thought was pretty funny was your revelation that the arts community had one of the biggest pay gaps. How do you explain that one, Nick?
I can't explain that. The data, when it's published, doesn't provide the causal factors, so you've got to just interpret it yourself. But I couldn't work it out. And also healthcare, I thought was interesting as well. Healthcare, the gap is widened, and so is the gap in the Northern Territory. So I can't explain it, but that's what the ABS is reporting. So very interesting statistic.
Oh, I'm actually surprised that the headline articles in the ABC weren't about why the healthcare industry is failing on the gender pay gap. That would have been my first thought. But is there any other interesting lesson that we can take from this data? Anything you found particularly useful about it? Or do you think it's going to become extinct in a short period of time, especially as we lose touch of men and women?
Yeah, I think you make a good point. I think that unless somebody at some point says, okay, well, we really should try and do an apples and apples comparison, the data is essentially worthless. I suspect that those that promote it and those that use it have a sort of a broader agenda. They're wanting to really displace from the workforce certain sorts of groups. You know, the commonly cited, the sort of the white middle-aged man. He seems to sort of come out second best on just about every issue to do with gender. And so I think that while there is a gap, those that promote various groups in the workplace, particularly female, obviously, can cite that data and really push hard and put pressure on companies.
Yes, well, as people keep saying, if it was legal to pay women less, the entire workforce would be female, not male. But of course, that is not the case. And I think, as you suggested, there are a lot of interesting revelations. But I think it more displays women's choice of job, as you were saying, that perhaps women have a slightly different preference for the jobs that they take. We're not down in the mining trenches, we're not off on oil rigs, and perhaps there's a good reason for that. But look, Nick, thank you so much for your articles. You've been writing some fascinating stuff lately, and those two in particular I think are well worth everyone's time. So thank you for joining us here today on Spectator TV.
Thanks very much, Alexandra.